with Ambassador Venkatesh Varma, India's former ambassador to the Russian Federation from 2018 to 2021, which means he just retired very recently. Ambassador Varma is also one of India's foremost nuclear experts. He cut his teeth at the Conference of Disarmament in Geneva in the mid-90s, and since then has been very much involved negotiating the 123 agreement, the Indo-US nuclear deal, which means he knows both sides of the fence, both the US and Russia very well. And today, of course, we're talking about the crisis in Ukraine. It's the fifth day since Russian troops invaded Ukraine, and the West has since imposed a lot of sanctions, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So let me first welcome you to ThePrint. Ambassador Varma, welcome.
Thank you, Jyoti. Good to be with you.
So first of all, let's just talk about the situation on the ground. It's day 5 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And in these last 5 days, the UN Security Council has met twice, as well as the UNGA, the UN General Assembly, has met. India has abstained on both votes at the UN Security Council, along with China. But since then, the West has also moved very strongly to impose a series of sanctions against Russia, sanctioning not just President Vladimir Putin, but his close circle, his allies. In fact, the Russian stock exchange failed to open on Monday. The ruble has crashed. So basically, there is an attempt to undermine the Russian economy. Your first comments on what's going on?
Well, this conflict between Russia and Ukraine was not unexpected, but the nature of the military conflict has taken probably the whole world by surprise. Largely on account of the fact that there's been no accommodation on the side of anyone, neither on the Russian side, nor on the Ukrainian side, Europeans or the Americans. Russia, of course, crossed a very, very big red line internationally, which is sending troops into Ukraine against its sovereignty and territorial integrity. But that is not the only red line that has been crossed. So we are in the early stages of a very disturbing and very alarming conflict situation. Difficult to draw definitive conclusions, but I think some trends are fairly visible in the first 5-6 days of this latest phase of conflict between Russia and Ukraine.
So, Ambassador Varma, the first round of the so-called peace talks between the Russians and the Ukrainians have taken place in Belarus on Monday. But it seems that, first of all, are you surprised that the West has moved so swiftly to sanction the Russians? Did you expect this to happen? And how do you think this is playing out inside Russia?
Well, this has been an elaborate process of negotiation under the threat of use of force. Russia mobilized over 150,000, 200,000 troops since December. They have continued parallelly to talk. There have been several rounds of discussions, both with the Americans, the Europeans, some dialogue with the Ukrainians themselves. Russia, in commencing its military operations in Ukraine, has also seems to be taking it in a step-by-step manner. They have not yet deployed a majority of their forces. The firepower of Russia is still to be deployed. They have looked at some major cities, but the real force of the military machine of Russia is still to be deployed and employed in Ukraine. Similarly, the West also has gone through a set of sanctions. They thought they would have a calibrated process. But the surprising part and the alarming part is how quickly this conflict has escalated. So the dialogue that took place yesterday was a part of the negotiating process under the threat and use of force on both sides. The Ukrainian resistance is also surprising, I think, for the Russians as well. But the main conflict is yet to be joined. So the Russians and the Ukrainians themselves have agreed that there'll be another round of negotiations. But let us be clear, this is no longer just a fight between Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine is now getting the active military assistance of a number of European states who are members of NATO, It is also getting active assistance from the United States. The United States has actively deployed one of its most powerful instruments of statecraft and diplomacy, which is the weaponization of finance. That is in full display. So this conflict has been joined. And finally, while Russia and Ukraine are talking, the final settlement will have to be taken between Moscow and Washington, because this is really now a fight between Russia and Ukraine. It is also quickly becoming a fight between Russia and Europe and the larger West as a whole. And we are, I think, as a matter of concern, that we are just in the early stages of the conflict.
So, Ambassador, you've said a lot of things. The first is you're saying that it's in the early stages of the conflicts and that the Russians have not used their full firepower. So do you think that the Russians can go to the next stage? Can they deploy more weapons, which means that more civilians will be killed in this crossfire?
Well, that cannot be ruled out. Obviously, the Russians are in a process of the threat of use of force in the larger context of negotiations. President Macron spoke to President Putin last evening. There were 4 very clear demands being put out by Russia. Those are not new demands, but Russia is not compromising on those demands. So therefore, I think we are in a phase where both sides are talking, but also negotiating very hard. And there is absolutely no give on either side. So what can be safely predicted is that we are in a process of escalation. This is, of course, dangerous and very alarming because these things should not be taken too far. But there is, thankfully, mercifully, the silver lining to this very, very dark clouds, which is the lines of communication and negotiation are still on. It is not just between Russia and Ukraine, but between Russia and Europe and the United States as well.
So Ambassador Varma, this face-off between Russia and the US, did you expect this to happen?
Well, the face-off has been there for a while. One of the main topics of discussion between Russia and the United States in the summit that took place in Geneva last year between President Biden and President Putin was on the issue of how European security could be addressed in a manner that would accommodate Russian concerns on Ukraine. The Ukrainian situation has been deteriorating for a while now. 2014 was one major step, but Ukraine asked for NATO membership, which was a red line for Russia, in 2002. It was offered a so-called open door without a specific commitment on a timeline for membership in 2008. That has, of course, strengthened the hardline position of Ukraine. Ukraine was given the belief that it would be protected vis-a-vis vis-a-vis its concerns on Russia by NATO membership. NATO membership has not occurred, but Ukrainian armed forces have been strengthened to the level of NATO levels in many respects. And some of the resistance that you're seeing today from the Ukrainian armed forces, which is there in the social media, is because of the tremendous growth in the firepower and fighting capacity of the Ukrainian armed forces, which is the result of assistance that has been given in the last 4 or 5 years. So Russia is a very formidable military power, but we cannot rule out the strength, the resistance that the Ukrainian military can also put up.
But surely, Ambassador, go ahead. No, I'm saying surely, if somebody invades your country, surely you would expect them to fight for themselves, to stand up for themselves, to defend themselves, and surely they will then ask their fellow nations or allies. Now, even Norway is supplying anti-tank weapons, I think 2,000 or something, apart from the fact that the European Union is giving them other armor, the Americans, like you said. But wouldn't you say that the Ukrainians are justified in doing what they're doing, which is defending themselves with arms?
Well, that is obvious. Every country has the right to defend when foreign troops have intervened on their territory. But that is just one aspect of the situation. Ukraine has sought security through NATO since 2002. 20 years later to be invaded by your neighboring country is no mark of success of your security policy. Similarly, European security is now practically in shambles because the last 30 years of absolute supremacy that and the power differential that existed between NATO and Russia has come to naught. Of course, the Russians have also paid a very, very steep price. I don't think the coming together of the European Union, the coming together of NATO, or the absolute resolve that has been shown in Washington was anticipated by Russia, just as there was a miscalculation on the Western side of Russian weakness, which is not so weak. I think there was a miscalculation on the Russian side of the resolve that can come about both in Brussels and in Washington in taking on this new Russian threat and a not so new Russian threat. And that, as you have rightly mentioned, it's seen in Norway, in Berlin, in Switzerland. The entire European airspace is closed to Russia.
Right.
The banking system has got disconnected. There are sanctions which are of a hugely crippling nature and a system distorting nature as a thing that we've not seen before. Putting it in context, this is the first time that a major power, which is Russia, is taking on an established security order in Europe, and an established security order dominated and overseen by the Americans. So it is, in fact, a challenge to unipolarity of America in Europe. And the unipolarity, as we see now, is pretty strong. It is capable of coming together pretty quickly for very effective action. And and Russia is now the subject of these very hugely restrictive measures that are being imposed on it.
So you think President Putin miscalculated when he invaded Ukraine?
Well, there are miscalculations of various levels on every side.
Yeah, but on the Russian side, what do you say? Would you say that President Putin miscalculated?
The ferocity and the unity that has been shown in the Western reaction, I presume, has not been anticipated in Moscow.
But are you surprised by that? Because usually, Putin is quite careful about these things. He's been either prime minister or president of Russia for the last 22 years. He's suddenly not about to make a mistake like this. Why do you think he crossed the line?
I'm surprised by the quickness in which the Western unity has been brought about. This is, in fact, a new development. And there are several layers to this. I think the United States is reasserting its leadership in Europe. It had neglected Europe for almost 30 years. Germany is coming into its own finally. Even neutral countries such as Switzerland are seeing the systemic threat that they perceive from Russia crossing the very strong red line. But I think it is also a measure of the resolve of Russia, because Russia has said all along that Ukraine is an existential issue for it. We may not agree with it, we may not understand it, but that is how that is the basis on which Russia is
Ambassador Varma, the question is that, we know that Russia and Ukraine have long-standing, very old historical ties, very deep religious ties. But does this justify the Russian invasion of another sovereign nation? Ukraine is a sovereign country. Last we heard.
Nothing justifies the invasion of another country. But I think you also have to see the rights of sovereignty and territorial integrity into a realistic context. You live in a real world. You live in a world where geopolitics is reasserting itself. The protections that were provided by globalization and by alliance systems of the old sorts are no longer affording the protection. Now, you can have distant patrons, but the yardstick of success of any policy is whether it affords you security. Now, NATO membership has been a red line for Russia for one, not just Putin, from Yeltsin's time. Now, I think it's been a failure of imagination on part of the West to construct a European security structure in the last 3 decades, that would also take into account the interests of Russia. It was eminently possible in the 1990s, more so again in the 2000s, less so in the last 10 years. But this is an opportunity that has been squandered. Similarly, on part of Russia, I think to cut itself off on its western flank and have the animosity that it has generated in the Western world, with which once was its topmost priority in foreign policy, can be described as nothing less than a failure of its European security policy for the last 30 years.
But wouldn't you say it's a failure of Putin's policy? I mean, it may be a failure of Russia's European security policy, but I think it's a failure. I mean, my question to you is that isn't this a failure of Putin's policy, of Putin's leadership?
Well, whether Russia comes out of it protecting its core national interests as defined by Russia, and this is the point I'm trying to make, no explanation is a justification. The explanation that I'm trying to provide is that Russia has always said that Ukraine is an existential issue in security terms, in cultural terms, in political terms. For the first 20 years after the end of the Cold War, Russia was prepared to live with Ukraine in a manner where Ukraine retained its sovereignty and territory.
And I got that, Ambassador Varma, but my question is that while Ukraine is an existential issue for Russia, does this give Russia or President Putin the justification to bomb innocent people in Ukraine?
No, obviously not. I mean, that is very clear. But right. Countries will tend to protect their interests with the means that they have at their disposal. So I think it is also a measure of anticipation by Ukraine and by the West, which have led up the Ukrainians up the garden path to say that external security will be provided in the case of Russian threats. Well, what do we have today? It is a conflict zone in the center of Europe. It is obviously a failure of Russian policy, but it is in equal measure a failure of policy of European security. Now, because you have a conflict situation that is no longer going to remain limited, there are many stakeholders to this conflict, and of course there is huge collateral damage that is there, not just for the region but for global security as a whole.
The fact that President Putin and his inner circle of advisors have been sanctioned, like the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and various other people, how do you think that the Russians are dealing with this? The stock market is crashing. The ruble has plunged about 40% or so. How long do you think that this is going on? And do you think that the Russian leadership is, how do you think they're going to deal with this?
Well, Russia's ability to take pain should not be underestimated. And that is related to the fact that Ukraine is an existential problem for them. You and I might disagree, and there are, I think, good grounds to disagree with that assessment, but that is the basis on which they are acting. Now, to sanction a president, to cut off Russia from SWIFT, and to sanction its central bank in normal circumstances is an act of war. Because this is now no longer purely a war between Russia and Ukraine on the ground in Ukraine, but it is also spread to other aspects of international engagement, especially in the financial sector, in the energy sector. Sanctioning a head of state, sanctioning a foreign minister is closing the doors for dialogue and negotiation. So these have escalatory steps which nobody could have anticipated, say, 10 days ago. But as I said in the beginning of my comments, there is no accommodation on either side presently, because the military force is an unresolved area. The Ukrainians believe, and the West believes, that Russia will get bogged down. Russia still believes that it has still a huge amount of military reserve, which it can settle this problem through military force in Ukraine. So nobody wants to negotiate. And therefore, the escalatory measures that have been going on are visible today. I mean, sanctioning a head of state and a foreign minister is not a trivial escalatory measure. It is almost an act of war.
But Ambassador Varma, do you feel that there is a disquiet inside you, as there is certainly with me, but I think also in the Indian establishment, because over the two Security Council resolutions, the UN Security Council resolutions, India has abstained on both fronts. The question is, what is the message that Putin is sending? That he can walk, even if Ukraine is an existential matter for him. Can China walk across the line of actual control tomorrow and take Indian territory? Can India walk into Pakistan-occupied Kashmir and take that territory? I mean, that's the message that Putin is sending.
Well, let us discuss, focus our analysis on what's happening between Russia and Ukraine.
No, but really, this is, that's the message that people will get all over the world. That if you want it enough, then you can be the big bully and you can walk into another country and say, this is mine, and then defend it as much, as well as you can.
No, I think we need to understand it in a far more deeper level than this superficial analysis that an explanation of a vote or a vote in the Security Council is our complete assessment on the evolving geopolitical situation. Okay. And I think our diplomacy, rightly so, is combined realism with pragmatism and with a tactical flexibility. The realism is that European security is in a complete mess. We didn't contribute to it. We are not party to it. But the pragmatic assessment, which informs our decision making, is that we will be affected by this conflict, and most directly and most immediately in the context of the well-being of our nationals and our students who need to get out of the war zone in Ukraine. But tactical flexibility. Now, the Ukrainian problem is not going to go away. There is enough blame to go all around. As I said, Russia has crossed a very big red line, but there are several other geopolitical red lines that have been crossed by others. Now, I think it is sane and prudent for India to retain its own space. Its own space is that we have stood up for fundamental principles of the UN Charter, but we've also stood up for the negotiating space that we need with all interlocutors, and that includes Russia, that involves Ukraine. Our Prime Minister has spoken both to President Putin and to President Zelensky. We are in touch with European leaders. We are in touch with the Americans. This is an ongoing game, and we are affected by the blowback coming from this geopolitical conflict. But merely to hunker down and seek a false comfort in, just to get away from the temporary pressure that has been, diplomatic pressure that has been exerted on us, I don't think is the right way to proceed. I think we have proceeded with caution. This is still the evolving stage of a very major geopolitical conflict that is taking place in Europe. It will have repercussions in our area, for us, for a bilateral relationship with Russia, with the European Union, with Ukraine, with the United States, but also in the larger Indo-Pacific region. So what starts in Europe will not stay in Europe, as we all know.
What are the red lines that the Western Bloc has crossed?
Well, the red lines is that you have to have in your geopolitical engagement some form of accommodation. Mm-hmm. There has been negligible accommodation of Russian interests in Europe. Russia was considered weak. It is still probably relatively weak. But I think the fundamental strategic mistake that has been made both in Brussels and Washington is that you don't have to be completely assured of victory to use military force. Even weak powers, when they are pushed into a corner, do use military force. And the fact of life, I think we all tend to forget, is that for core interests, as defined by a particular power, a particular major power, countries are willing to use military force. And this is not the first time, and this is definitely will not be the last time that such actions take place. That is not a justification. Okay. That is not an excuse for what Russia is doing, but it is understandable, and it is according to a pattern. And if you have geopolitical conflict, that can be resolved only through military force with no accommodation, absolutely no accommodation. And there was, as the Russians have been saying for the last 6 months, there's been a pretense of accommodation. So this entire process of using Ukraine to put a point of pressure on Russia has reached a point where it is lashing back. It may be unsuccessful. It may lead to a quagmire. But the fact is that it has gotten back and in the process taken down European security to new depths as unseen since the end of the Cold War.
And you understand why Russia has therefore gone to war?
No. Explaining Russian action is not a justification for Russian action. Explaining Western NATO action is not a justification for NATO action. I'm just trying to say this is how the real world is. And I think we need to be prepared in our analysis, in our policy making, that this is a real world. Countries will exploit weakness. Countries will fight even if there is no assurance of victory in war for what they define as core interests. And the biggest problem that we face today in terms of larger geopolitical analysis, Russia today is joining the group of countries of large continental powers which have very troubled peripheries. And that is familiar to us. We are a large continental country in Asia. We've had troubled peripheries on both our borders since what? Since independence. And that troubled peripheries is only getting more and more of a problem for us. Mm-hmm. Russia's Western peripheries were settled twice in the last 100 years, 3 times. In 1917, after its revolution, the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, in 1945, and in 1991. What was agreed in 1991 as a security architecture for Europe is now in shambles. Russia is now trying to remake it in its own fashion. The NATO will respond in remaking it in its own fashion. But the fact is that the troubled periphery on the Western side has become more troubled. Russia will be bogged down in taking up, fighting the fires from the Baltics to Ukraine now and the Caucasus and the Black Sea area for the foreseeable future. A big continental power that is fighting fires on its western borders will have less time to look after its eastern borders. And this is our part of the world.
But Ambassador Varma, yeah. No, your point about Russia determined to settle its troubled peripheries is well taken. And while I'm not saying that you're justifying the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you're trying to understand it. But my question to you is that what is the message from what Putin has done? Like I said, Chinese troops are sitting at the line of actual control in Ladakh for the last 2 years. Perhaps if they feel like it tomorrow morning over a cup of tea or soon after they have their morning cup of tea, the Chinese president can order his troops to march into Ladakh. Now, there are Indian troops in eastern Ladakh right now, but the point I'm making is that this is a message for bullies all over the world that they can do what they want.
No, these false analogies are very comforting, it's good for media, but they don't make good geopolitical conclusions. Okay. There is no comparison between India and Ukraine. There is no comparison between the Ukrainian relationship with Russia and the Indian situation with China. In our case, China has violated existing agreements for tranquility on our border. It is trying to settle a border dispute by the use or threat of use of force. It has met its match. It will more than meet its match if it were to up the escalatory ladder of putting pressure on India. India is no walkover. India is no pushover. So Chinese will not try India because there is a level of deterrence that has already been established in Ladakh. So I think our analysis to run helter-skelter to say that, what is happening in Ukraine will happen on a Ladakh border will not happen, primarily because of not the goodwill of Russia or the goodwill of China or the fact that Chinese have not learned the lesson from Russia. It will not happen because of Indian deterrence capabilities, which are very, very formidable. So therefore, I think to making these false notions, I think is I think is not helpful. What is, I think, the real message here is that we are living in an era of big power conflict where neither of the big powers are willing to show accommodation vis-a-vis each other. So the 1945 construct and the 1991 construct that came about is falling apart. We need to find our own space. We need to retain our own ability to think for ourselves. Mm-hmm. And we need to have confidence in our own policies and in our own strengths. And I think to both to be scared or to be overawed or to draw the wrong lessons, I think is a recipe for our own failures in policy in the future.
Okay, in the you wrote an article in the Indian Express a few days ago in which you very dismissively or pejoratively used this phrase called the Beltway bubble analysis. I assume you're talking about the Beltway around Washington, D.C. What exactly did you mean by that?
Well, Beltway bubble is not my invention. It already exists as a lexicon. I don't know whether it is pejorative or not. I don't think there has been, very rarely there's been a war that the Beltway bubble has not supported. But equally true is there's never been a war that the Americans have won because of Beltway bubble analysis. So let us see what they are. But I think just because their analysis is written in English and we have good engagement with them doesn't mean that their analysis is valuable or has to be taken hook, line, and sinker by India. Indian analysis should be for Indian interests. In a very troubled world, in a world where use of force, the restraints against the use of force is becoming less and less, the need for accommodation amongst the big powers is becoming more and more, but the propensity to accommodate each other's interests is becoming less and less. And I think we need to be prepared for a very troubled future. And the best assurance of dealing with a troubled future is to have faith and confidence in our own strength, to have faith and confidence in our own analysis. We should be independent in our thought and independent in action, but have the wherewithal for independent thought and action. And the wherewithal will come with sensible engagement with the international community. That includes Russia, that includes Europe, that includes the United States, but that also includes taking on our conflictual relationship with China in a sensible and sustainable manner, consistent with our interests, but also consistent with the ability and the lessons that we are learning from the global situation. That big powers are committed to their own interests, and to expect that big powers will come to our defense, I think is a sad proposition.
So I'm going to ask you I'm going to ask you the China question in a second. But before that, let me say that today Putin is looking completely isolated. I mean, he's got countries like Cuba and Venezuela supporting him, and India, of course. India abstained, so did China. So is that the company we want to keep, Ambassador Varma? Cuba, Venezuela, China?
You see, when you're defending your core interests as you define them, I think company is the last thing that you should be worried about. But we should not reach a place where you need to defend your core interests alone. That is the sum and substance of diplomacy. What did Bismarck say? Political judgment in diplomacy is to hear the hoof steps of the horses of history well before they arrive. So if we are to anticipate global trends, let us start by stop drawing the wrong conclusions. Let us see what the global trends portray. It is a raw contest for power among the big powers. There is very little accommodation to each other. So therefore, if there's little accommodation with each other, let us not be naive to expect that there will be accommodation towards us. They will fight your battles while they have bigger battles to fight elsewhere. And the American recommitment to NATO and to Europe is happening right in front of our eyes. So if you think that we have other countries which are wanting to take on Indian interests, I think we are sadly mistaken. Similarly, the big powers that are railed against us, which want to expand their influence, that is India's interests, should be given the message that there are very strong red lines that will be backed by very specific deterrence capabilities of India, that we will not let that happen. That is your biggest comfort, not comfort of a voting situation in the General Assembly. I think we should get out of that thing. The world today is such that we are not the comfort that you will get in General Assembly and Security Council votes is a false comfort. It may make you feel good, but it doesn't provide you security.
What is the comfort that you want from the Russians?
Well, the Russians will fight their own battles. They have reached an accommodation with the ground realities in Ukraine, depending on the military situation, and the final deal that they will do with Ukraine vis-a-vis the West. That we'll wait and see. There is little that we can do to influence the situation.
That's fine. But what is the comfort that you derive from not coming out wholeheartedly in support of the Russians because you cannot justify the invasion of Ukraine? But having said that, what is the comfort that you're deriving from abstaining? I mean, the abstaining is just a symbol of the larger picture of your interests that you believe are aligned with Russians.
No, I think the fundamental message coming out of our vote in the Security Council is not to give comfort to Russia. It's to retain diplomatic maneuverable space for India. I think that is the right way to go. The resolution itself was vetoed, so it is a dead letter in terms of its effectiveness.
Right.
If you had voted in favor of the resolution, it would have been that India was committing itself to a dead letter, where, as we have discussed during this program, that Russia crossing the border into Ukraine is not the only red line that has been crossed.
Okay. So tell me, Ambassador Varma, you're a nuclear expert. Why did President Putin, why has he put his strategic command on nuclear alert? I mean, that's a bit excessive, isn't it?
No, I agree. That is very alarming. But the Russians are putting into the basket several levers that they wish to put forward. But so are the Europeans and the Americans. When was the last time that the entire European airspace was closed out? When was the last time a country was disconnected to SWIFT? When was the central bank reserves of a country of a nuclear power held to confiscated basically? When did that last happen? You might give the examples of Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, or North Korea.
Iraq, Afghanistan.
But Russia is not a country of that nature. I mean, the entire Eurasian landmass continent is, half of it is Russia. So if you are escalating the conflict to that level, I think the protagonists to this conflict should be aware that the escalatory level can be of different types.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about China. Now, China, as we know, Chinese President Xi Jinping and the Russian president are quite close friends. They've met 38 times, most recently when Putin went to Beijing for the Olympic Games. But the question is, even at the Security Council, and I'm sorry to keep coming back to the Security Council, but in the two votes, China's position itself evolved. And I think China is also exhibiting a certain amount of discomfort and disquiet regarding what Putin has done. Of course, they abstained the first time. The second time around at the UNGA, they voted along with the Russians. But they are exhibiting. So if the Chinese are uncomfortable, that must be saying something.
No, more than the discomfort of the Chinese, I think the Chinese are seeing space for themselves. They are carving out space for themselves. So there are two big powers fighting over Ukraine in Europe. And the Chinese are wanting margins of advantage both with the Russians and with the Americans. And once the United States dropped the demand for a Chapter 7 resolution, the Chinese took it as a plus for Russia and abstained. So the Chinese are cutting deals with both. But that is what is to be expected of a big power behavior in the Security Council. So there are no permanent fixtures in terms of interests. It is your specific interests that the Chinese are pursuing. So that should not come as a surprise. In fact, that is precisely the sort of pursuit of self-interest that our analysts should encourage and pursue, because this is a very troubled world. Multipolarity is being born not through dialogue. Multipolarity is being born through conflict. The situation in Europe and the conflict over over Ukraine is a very specific example that, short of mutual accommodation among the big powers, you will probably have to take some of your space. The space will not be given to you. That is the message that is coming out. The unipolarity in certain respects is still very, very formidable. The United States today is a unipolar world, especially in the financial, banking, and the trade spheres. At the drop of a switch, it can shut down whole economies, and we are seeing that play out vis-a-vis Russia. But the world is not unipolar in other respects. Multipolarity also requires that we retain our own space. If there is conflict between two other poles, it is foolish on our part to try to hide between or hide beneath one of the poles. Either you will get crushed or you will get forgotten. India is too large a country to be either crushed or to be forgotten. So I think we should retain our own space, pursue our own interests, and build up our own strengths.
But in this particular case, Ambassador Varma, with China and Russia coming closer and closer together, how does India look at it? I mean, India and China have been hostile neighbors for the last couple of years since the Chinese came to stand at the line of actual control without being invited. So don't you think that the Chinese are actually winning on both sides? Here are the Russians getting a bloody nose. And on the other hand, the Americans are getting more involved in this crisis in Europe. So the Chinese, they have ghee in both their hands, laddus in both their hands.
Well, whether this current situation, the way the situation is evolving in Europe, is of advantage to China, the answer is yes. I mean, it requires no major sense of analysis to come to that conclusion. But the fact is that there is nothing that China can do to help Russia's predicament in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. In fact, the past record shows that every time that Russia has had a problem in Central Asia or in Central or Eastern Europe, the space that has been vacated by Russia has been occupied by China. Mm-hmm. And we can see a repeat of this pattern in different parts of the world. But that said, finally, geopolitical stability at the global level will come through sensible policy on part of all the big powers, not just one erring power or one power which is aggressive and one power which is not. And therefore, we need to find our own space in this larger equilibrium. And there will be no global equilibrium without India. The last global equilibrium that came about in 1945 was without India. But this time, we should be clever enough, sensible enough, and strong enough to show that there will be no global equilibrium at India's expense. Now, that is a clear message that has gone out to China in the regional context. Now, we will find occasions to make the same measures vis-a-vis our other partners, including with the Russians and with the Americans and the Europeans. That this global compact that is to emerge out of this very clumsy, conflictual pangs of birth of a multipolar world, India should be accommodated.
So India should not behave like, it should not sort of shrug its shoulders and stay away from this messy crisis in Ukraine or in Central Europe. But you feel that India should watch for the situation, how it evolves, and remain engaged on all sides.
Yeah, that is right. That's sensible policy to do. And I think that is, that is what we are doing.
But do you feel, and this is the last question, do you feel that China will emerge stronger than the big powers or, than at least the Russians?
There are different, और भी गम है दुनिया में, except for Chinese, advantage in every sphere. We tend to both exaggerate Chinese strengths and Chinese influence in different parts of the world, including an exaggeration of the Russia-China relationship. I think that is done or sometimes out of...
an exaggeration of the Russia-China relationship.
Yes, of course. I mean,
but Russia is widely acknowledged to be a junior power of the Chinese.
Well, that is a myth. That all myths have their own shelf life. That will run into a reality very, very soon. It ran into a reality check in the Security Council, where the Chinese were not holding the Russian can at all. In fact, they were looking for their own spaces of which is only to be expected. But it is not consistent with this mythical view that we tend to sometimes believe is that Russia and China are working together. They will work together tactically. They will work together, but they have divergent interests, as can be expected between a country of Russia's strength and a country of China's strengths, and they have, in fact, more divergent interests than convergent interests. And it is to the task of our diplomacy to see how we can sort out those divergences and convergences to our best advantage.
So, Ambassador Varma, the last question: what is the moral of the story of the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Moral of the story is that today in 2022. Old type wars will be fought along with new type wars. You have wars in Ukraine where tanks are rolling across international borders. You have today in Ukraine cyber warfare, which is absolutely cutting edge. You have an economic and financial infrastructure that is being weaponized, of the likes of which we have never seen before. What starts in Europe will not stay in Europe. This is a problem between Russia and Ukraine, but this is quickly escalated and morphed into a problem between Russia and Europe. And as I said in my opening remarks, this will finally be settled when there is a modus vivendi between Moscow and Washington.
On this note, Ambassador Venkatesh Varma, thank you so much for your time, for explaining the big power politics at play on this over this Ukraine crisis between Russia and Ukraine, and of course the US. We shall be watching very closely how this unfolds over the next few days and weeks. Thank you again for speaking to ThePrint.
Thank you, Jyoti.